Let me describe a pattern that's probably familiar. Sales closes a deal with a customer who isn't quite right for your product. Maybe they're in the wrong segment. Maybe their use case is a stretch. Maybe they've been promised something the product can't actually deliver. The deal lands, the contract is signed, and the customer gets handed to customer success. And now your team is in cleanup mode. They're managing expectations that should never have been set. They're trying to deliver value that the product can't fully deliver. They're absorbing the friction of a relationship that was misaligned from day one. And 12 months later, when the renewal conversation goes badly or the customer churns, CS gets the question, what happened? What happened is that CS was asked to fix something that wasn't theirs to fix in the first place. And nobody asked them before the decision was made because CS doesn't have veto power. CS is the cleanup crew, not a decision maker. The CS function that wants to actually drive retention and growth has to stop being the cleanup crew. It has to earn a seat at the table where the upstream decisions get made, and the authority to push back when those decisions are going to create problems CS will be left to manage. That's what veto power is. And most CS leaders need it more than they realize. Today, we're talking about why your CS teams needs veto power, where you actually need it, and how to earn it without becoming the team that always says no. Stick around because at the end, I'll talk about where this work gets hardest and where leadership coaching actually moves the needle. Welcome to the CS RevSpeak podcast. I'm Angeline Gavino. I spent 17 years leading customer success inside B2B SaaS, most recently as a VP of CS. And today, I coach customer success leaders one-on-one on the exact challenges you're navigating right now. Everything I share in this podcast comes from time actually doing the work and time spent helping other leaders lead better. I talk about building credibility, turning customer success into a revenue engine, scaling your team, and navigating the leadership challenges nobody prepares you for. Let's dive into today's episode. Let me start by defining veto power, because the term can sound more aggressive than what we're actually talking about. Veto power, in the way that I'm using it here, is the authority to push back on a decision that affects your function before that decision is finalized. It's not the power to unilaterally block anything. It's the power to be in the conversation, raise concerns with weight, and influence outcomes when the impact on CS is significant. Now, let me say what veto power isn't. Veto power is not about CS being able to say no to any deal that sales wants to close. Sales has authority over commercial decisions. CS having veto power doesn't override that. Veto power is not about CS becoming an obstruction in cross-functional decisions. Functions that operate as gatekeepers get worked around. That's the opposite of what we want. Veto power is not about complaining loudly when decisions go wrong after the fact. That's not authority. That's just noise. What veto power actually looks like in practice is this. When a major customer affecting decision is being made, like a deal that's a stretch fit, a product change that affects existing customers, a process change that shifts how CS operates, a pricing decision that changes what CS is asked to deliver, CS is in the room. CS is heard, and CS has the standing to say, this is going to create a problem we're going to have to absorb, and here's what it's going to cost. And that pushback actually shifts the decision or changes the path forward. It's about being a real voice in decisions that affect your function, not after the fact, before. And here's the thing. In most companies, CS doesn't have that. CS gets informed about decisions. CS gets briefed after the fact. CS gets asked to execute on what's already been decided. And when CS isn't in those conversations early, the function ends up in a permanent state of catching up, managing the consequences of decisions made without them. Let's talk about what's actually at stake, because if CS leaders don't make the case for veto power, nothing changes. And the case starts with being honest about what's being lost when CS doesn't have it. The first thing being lost is retention. When CS isn't in the room when bad fit deals are being closed, those deals turn into churn. Not always immediately. Sometimes they'll limp through one renewal cycle, but the data is consistent. Customers who shouldn't have been sold to in the first place churn at significantly higher rates than well-qualified customers. And every one of those churns reduces your GRR, drains CSM capacity, and damages the team's morale. The cost isn't theoretical, it's measurable. The second thing being lost is expansion. CS is one of the best early indicators of where expansion is possible and where it isn't. When CS isn't consulted on roadmap, pricing decisions, or new market entry, the company makes decisions that close off expansion paths that CS could have seen if they'd been asked. The org loses growth it could have captured. The third thing being lost is team trust. When your CSMs are repeatedly handed situations they can see were avoidable, situations they could have warned about if they've been consulted, they stop bringing their best thinking. They start to operate as executors rather than advisors. Why bring strategic insight if nobody asks for it? That cultural shift damages the function long after the specific decisions have been made. The fourth thing being lost is your credibility as a leader. When you're consistently in the position of explaining outcomes that weren't your function's fault, leadership starts to see you as a leader who manages problems rather than one who prevents them. That's a slow erosion of authority that's very hard to recover from. And here's the harder truth. Most CS leaders don't have veto power because they haven't built the case for it. They've waited to be invited into conversations. They've assumed their value could speak for itself. And in many cases, they've been so heads down on the operational work of running CS that they haven't done the political and strategic work of positioning the function as one that should have a voice in the upstream decisions. That's the work this episode is about. Not complaining that CS doesn't have power, earning it. If you are going to make the case for veto power, you need to be specific about where you need it. Asking for general authority is a losing proposition. Asking for specific authority over specific types of decisions with a clear rationale for each is how you actually win the argument. Here are the 4 areas where CS should have veto power in most organizations. The first is on fit qualification for prospects and customer decisions. When sales is closing a deal that's a clear stretch, wrong segment, wrong use case, wrong stakeholder profile, CS should have the standing to flag the risk and influence whether that deal moves forward in its current form. This doesn't mean CS gets to kill deals. It means CS gets to surface the predicted downstream impact and have that impact weighted in the decision. In some orgs, this is implemented as a formal deal review process where CS reviews stretch deals before close. In others is a more informal but consistent practice. Either way, the principle is that the people who will manage the customer should have a say in whether the customer is the right fit. The second is on product changes that affect existing customers. When product is making a change that will materially affect the customers your team is managing, like a feature deprecation, a UX shift, a pricing model change, CS should be in those conversations before the change is decided, not after, because the team that will absorb the customer impact should have a say in the size and shape of that impact. The third is on commitments being made by other functions to customers. When sales, executives, or partner teams commit something to a customer that CS will have to deliver, CS should be in the loop before the commitment is made. The classic version of this is sales promising a feature roadmap CS knows isn't realistic, or executives committing service levels CS can sustain. The CS function that will be held accountable for delivery needs visibility into what's being promised. The fourth is on changes to the CS operating environment itself. When decisions are being made about CS headcount, CS tools, CS process changes, or the structure of cross-functional handoffs that affect CS, the CS leader should be a decision maker, not someone who gets informed after the fact. This sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how often it isn't the reality. Notice that I'm not asking for veto power across the entire business. I'm being specific. Specificity is what makes the argument winnable. We need to be involved in everything is a losing argument. We need to be involved in these 4 specific types of decisions because here's the cost of not being involved is a winnable one. So how do you earn the credibility to actually have veto power? This is the part most CS leaders skip, and the part that actually determines whether veto power becomes real or stays theoretical. Authority isn't given, it's earned, and there's specific work involved in earning the credibility that makes veto power possible. There are 4 moves that earn credibility for CS as a function that deserves a voice in upstream decisions. The first move is to make the cost of being excluded visible. Every time a decision is made without CS that creates a downstream cost, like a deal closes that creates churn, a product change that creates customer friction, a sales commitment that creates a service gap, quantify it, track it, surface it consistently, not as a complaint, as data. Here's what happened, here's what it cost, here's what would have been different if we'd been in a conversation. Over time, that pattern becomes undeniable. Leadership starts to see that excluding CS has a price tag, and the case for including CS becomes self evident. The second move is to build CS into a function leadership wants to consult. This is where the strategic positioning work matters. If your function is seen as the cleanup crew, you don't get invited to decisions. If your function is seen as a source of strategic insight about customers, you do. The way you talk about CS in cross functional conversations, the analysis you bring to leadership meetings, the way you frame your team's work, all of that shapes whether other leaders see CS as a strategic partner or a downstream consequence. Be the function that brings insight, not just status updates. The third move is to build relationships with the leaders whose decisions affect you. Sales leadership, product leadership, the executive team. If those relationships only exist in formal meetings and escalations, you won't be looped in early. If they exist as ongoing strategic conversations, like informal one on ones, shared problem solving, mutual investment in each other's success, you will be. Authority follows relationships. You can't have veto power over people who don't talk to you regularly. The fourth move is to demonstrate good judgment in the situations you do have authority in. If your team's existing decisions are seen as well-reasoned, business-focused, and aligned with company priorities, leadership extends trust into adjacent areas. If your existing decisions are seen as overly protective of the CS function or disconnected from broader business context, leadership pulls back. Every decision you make is a credibility deposit or withdrawal. Make them count. I worked with a CS leader earlier this year who came into this exact situation. She'd been in the role for about a year. The team was performing well operationally, but she had no real voice in deals her team would eventually inherit. Sales would close stretch accounts and hand them over, and her team would spend the next 6 months absorbing the consequences. When she came to me, she was ready to push for a formal deal review process. We slowed it down. Before asking for the authority, we worked on the credibility piece, making the cost of bad fit deals visible to leadership with hard numbers, building stronger relationships with the sales leaders whose decisions were creating the problem, and positioning her perspective in leadership meetings as strategic rather than defensive. Within 6 months, the deal review request didn't have to be made formally. Sales leadership started looping her in on stretch deals proactively because they trusted her judgment and wanted to avoid the downstream cost. Veto power had been earned, not requested. Now, earning veto power is one thing. Using it well is another, because the team that gets a voice and then uses it to block everything quickly loses that voice. There's a craft to pushing back that determines whether your authority grows over time or erodes. Here are a few principles for using veto power well. First, be selective about when you push back. If CS is in every leadership conversation and finds something to object to every time, your input gets discounted. People stop listening because they expect dissent. The credibility of your pushback comes from how rarely you use it. Pick the battles that genuinely matter. Absorb the smaller ones. Second, bring the alternative when you push back. The team that says this won't work without offering a path forward becomes a team people avoid. The team that says this won't work and here's what I'd recommend instead becomes the team that people want to consult. Always have a recommendation. Pushing back without alternatives is going to undermine your credibility. Third, focus on business impact, not CS impact. When you push back, frame the cost in terms that the broader business cares about. Not this is going to make CS job harder, but this is going to reduce our renewal rates in this segment, which puts X dollars of ARR at risk over the next 12 months. Translation matters. Speak in the language of the business, not the language of your function. Fourth, be willing to be overruled gracefully. Even when you have veto power, sometimes you'll be outvoted. The decision will go away you advise against. How you handle that moment shapes whether your veto power survives. The leaders who throw a fit when they're overruled lose authority. The leaders who acknowledge the decision, commit to making it work, and document the predicted impact for future reference build authority over time. Because if the predicted impact materializes, the next conversation gets weighted differently. The most common pattern I see when CS leaders start using new authority is overreach, pushing back on too much, too often, in ways that frame CS as the function that's hard to work with. The leaders who use veto power well are the ones who treat it like a scarce resource, deploy it precisely, and let their selectivity be part of what builds the credibility for the next use. CS earning veto power isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous practice of building credibility, demonstrating judgment, and using authority well so that the next time you need to push back, your voice is weighted heavier. The CS leaders who get this right move from being the cleanup crew to being a real strategic voice in their org. The ones who don't stay stuck managing the consequences of decisions they were never asked about. Let's bring this together. First, understand what veto power is. It's the authority to be in the room and influence decisions that affect your function before they're finalized. Not the power to block, the power to push back with weight and shift the outcomes. Second, name what's lost without it. Retention, expansion, team trust, and your credibility as a leader. CS without veto power stays in cleanup mode permanently. Third, be specific about where you need it. Fit qualification on deals, product changes affecting existing customers, commitments other functions make to your customers, changes to the CS operating environment. Specificity is what makes the argument winnable. Fourth, earn the credibility before you ask for the authority. Make the cost of excluding CS visible. Position your function as strategic. Build relationships that make consultation natural and demonstrate good judgment in the decisions you already own. And fifth, use veto power well. Be selective. Bring alternatives. Frame in business terms. Be overruled gracefully when it happens. The way you use authority determines whether you keep it. The hardest part of building veto power isn't the framework. It's the positioning work, the way you show up in leadership meetings, the relationships you build, the credibility you earn over time. Those are the things that actually shift whether CS gets a seat at the table. And they're deeply specific to your org, your stakeholders, and the dynamics you're navigating right now. That's the threshold where this episode stops being enough. If you're working through how to position yourself and your function to actually earn the authority that you need without becoming the team that always says no, that's exactly the work I do in my one-on-one executive coaching. We'll look at what's actually happening in your org, identify the credibility moves that will move you forward, and work through the specific conversations you need to have. If you want to work through that, head on over to csrevspeak.com/coaching and schedule a consult call. I'd love to work through it with you. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.